Good evening, everyone. This is a meeting of the Policy Subcommittee of the School Committee. We have several agenda items for today, and the first one will be review and approval of the minutes of the September 29th meeting. Have subcommittee members had an opportunity to review the minutes?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Would someone like to move them?
I'll move the minutes.
Okay, thank you, Valerie. Is there a second? Thank you, Jennifer. Okay, Valerie, your vote?
Yes.
Jennifer?
Yes.
Andy?
Yes.
And I also vote yes. All right, next up, we have a discussion of the school admissions policy draft and a possible vote on it. I'll hand this now over to Ms. Greeny, who very kindly went through this and provided the draft for us. I met with her as well as Erin Cooley toward the end of last week, where we discussed some of these changes that were about to be made. Go ahead, Megan.
Thank you so much for having me. The proposed changes to the admissions policy center around Section 2, the verification of residency. And these changes specifically are requesting to become a little bit less specified than they are in the current policy, giving the Public Schools of Brookline staff a little bit more latitude to work with families regarding the specific documentation that they might provide us to prove their eligibility and residency here to attend the Public Schools of Brookline. So rather than having a complete list listed in the policy, which can become outdated over time, as some of the documents currently listed might be considered a little bit out of date to how landlords and tenants work today. To give us greater latitude, be less specific. So rather than listing out the specifics, just indicate that they should be expected to provide 3 or more records as we request at the time of enrollment. This will also give us the greater flexibility to work with families who might find themselves in different circumstances, to be more equitable to our families who may not have followed traditional ownership or rentership or utility payments that we would expect of other families. So this gives us the flexibility to meet families where they're at while still maintaining the spirit of the residency policy. The secondary section is the subsequent enrollment annual renewal. So this section sort of just flipped the order around a bit, asking families that they should verify their home address and telephone number each year and sign an affidavit of residency once during each school year. This is something that they are supposed to do through the data verification process each September. But if they miss it then, they should be able to do it anytime they like. And that any irregularities would be reported to the Office of Registration and Enrollment. And then if they change their address, they should do so within 5 days. There's no change textually here. It's just been flipped around a bit. And then the office name has been updated to be current and accurate. And then all students shall provide updated proof of residency upon request to demonstrate continued enrollment eligibility. And that should be done several times throughout a student's academic career. And again, without being super specific about when that would be, we have a demographic of number of students in the Public Schools of Brookline, which is wonderful. That is just simply too large to check everybody every year. And some families are lucky enough to have multiple children in their household. So every time they come through my office, we verify their whole family. So that sort of hits a reset button. So it becomes very difficult to be specific. You should be checked every 3rd year. But for cases, maybe we've already checked you because you've got another child who's enrolled for kindergarten the previous year. So it wouldn't be like 3rd grade. It might end up being 6th grade for that family, for that specific child. But it gives us, again, the latitude to ask families anytime we need to, if there's any suspicion of any irregularities. And that families should be expected to do this multiple times throughout their career here in Brookline to make sure that they continue to reside here.
All right, thank you. Do any subcommittee members have questions?
I do. So my read of this is that there's an appeal process for the subsequent registration and enrollment, but not the original. And so my question for all of us to sort of think about is whether, given that we're making it more flexible, we want there to be an appeal mechanism in the first instance.
So that is the original language. I did take that out, I believe, in the draft. Because we do have an appeal process for
Sorry.
families in both circumstances.
It might be in the tiny print that I didn't get. Where was that deleted, Megan? I'm sorry, I'm not finding it.
So I'm not sure where you're looking.
So I'm looking at the red line right now. So I'm at 2A.
2A, okay.
The initial enrollment.
Yeah. For the resident should be include 3 or more records as designated by the Office of Registration and Enrollment at the time of enrollment. That's all it says.
Right. And then given that we're giving more latitude on what is allowed as a document, I'm just thinking of it from an equity perspective, that if someone is perhaps coming from a different country, gets their paperwork in a little bit later, do they come in as a new enrollment again? Is that how that would work, as opposed to appealing a rejection?
So we have an appeal form that we are using currently for families who are not able to meet the specified list of documents that gives greater latitude of opportunities to provide different options to us already.
Appeal and termination is outlined in section 1. Right. I may have read that wrong. I was reading that only as applying to 1B, but if it applies to all of, right, because it says in section 1 above. If everybody else's read is that appeal applies to all cases, then I'm fine with that. I just want to make sure that the appeal was applicable to both an initial enrollment as well as a subsequent enrollment.
Val, is there some specific language that you would propose to make that clear?
So I'm looking at, upon the initial students, the student's enrollment shall be terminated, student's parent or guardian. So if you look at that paragraph right before 4,
Yes.
my read of that paragraph is because it prefaces it with someone essentially being investigated, that it applies only to someone who's already enrolled, as opposed to someone who's also trying to enroll for the first time.
Right.
So I guess I would just offer clarifying language that
Well, I think another way to maybe get around that is, so the sentence beginning, the student's parent or legal guardian may appeal the determination, could maybe take out the as outlined in section 1 above and just sort of have its own section for appeal. So it's clear that it applies to anything.
that would
Is that-
offer clarity from my perspective, yes.
So the appeal process for a finding of non-residency, I've never seen an official finding of non-residency for an initial enrollment.
So I guess part of that, though, right, is we had very specific documents from A, B, and C column. So you would always know that it was sort of applied in an equitable way. My concern, if you want to call it a concern, is really just is making sure that it's equitable. So that if some document, a work contract, or I don't know what, something is allowed for family A, but not allowed for family B, for whatever reason, a different person's reviewing it, that there's a process for having that reviewed. I don't know, I may be like completely the only one worried about this, but we're making it looser, which I understand it can be a great thing, but it can also, not by you, Megan, but it could be disparately impacting different folks, potentially.
In terms of internal practice,
Yeah.
as by our office, we have that documented. So there is a documented practice internally that should be followed and is published to the public. It's just not in the policy. That way it gives us latitude to update and change as needed, if that helps at all.
I do see Valerie's point, though, that if we no longer know what the specific documents are that's being looked at, and I understand why we want to go in that direction, and I completely agree with it. From the general public's perspective, there's no way of really knowing what were the documents that were reviewed for someone else and how someone would go about questioning a determination that was made. And to your earlier point about that you have not seen a determination made of non-residency, I think such a situation would be extremely rare, but I actually can recall one instance. There probably was not a formal determination, but there was someone who participated at public comment and there was an issue about whether residency had been established or not. So it probably isn't a foreseeable issue, at least. Do other subcommittee members or school committee members have thoughts on this specific point and or on anything else regarding this policy? Andy?
Thanks, David. Nothing to this specific point. I did have another place where I was a little confused on reading through it, and I was wondering if it can be clarified. So in the bullet point where it says subsequent enrollment shall be required of all students, etc. So that's in a section B that's headed subsequent enrollment parenthesis annual renewal. So that suggests that what we're calling subsequent enrollment is the same thing as the annual renewal. So then it goes on to say that, every year, at least once during each school year, you're supposed to provide an updated signed affidavit, right? So if that just is subsequent enrollment, then it's confusing to say that in the bullet that subsequent enrollment shall be required of all students multiple times throughout their academic career. I guess my question is subsequent enrollment just the same as the annual renewal? And if it is, then let's just take out the mention of it in the bullet point because it makes it sound like it's something separate.
So I might suggest something like subsequent enrollment documentation, maybe, shall be required, because I'm not going to require everybody to give me a utility bill every year. That's just unfair to families and not helpful for us to do it that frequently. But we do need to, the bullet point is really in reference to that documentation, that proof piece.
So the affidavit is going to be annual, but documentation may only be required once every few years.
Exactly, as needed.
Okay. I mean, I'm not sure I can draft a new version on the spot, but now I understand your meaning.
Andy, would it be clearer if instead of saying subsequent enrollment, it just said updated proof, since that seems to be what it really is about continued eligibility?
Yeah, I think maybe if the term subsequent enrollment isn't doing any work for us, if it's not a term of art, then we should just specify, annual affidavit and, documented proof, like at longer intervals, as required by your department, Megan.
Okay. Any other questions or points that subcommittee members would like to make, or Suzanne or anyone else? All right. Now, while it is always awkward to do a little bit of wordsmithing in the moment, I do understand that there is some degree of time pressure, right, Megan, about trying to get this through?
Yeah, we do want to make sure that we are presenting to families who are going to be registering for kindergarten and all the documentation that goes with that, which obviously has to be done sooner than the actual registration. So we would like to be able to explicate this for our families through that process. And that begins as soon as December, and the documentation has to be prepared in advance of that.
So can I ask Megan, I know it's not in the policy, but when you send out a communication to families, what are you going to include in that as examples of things that would be acceptable?
So the list of documents that we are requesting now are already published on the website. Those are the ones that we typically ask for. What we ask for just doesn't align with the ABC categories. Just they're not useful for our office. So we're looking to be able to align the policy with what we really ask for. And any family who's not able to meet those specific documents, we send them a secondary appeal option, which has a specified list and sequence of what we are happy to accept in conversation. Because not everybody fits the same bucket.
All right, so one suggestion I would like to make is hopefully we could vote on this today so we can at least move the process forward. So to Valerie's point, if we could, in section 3, enforcement, the last paragraph, if we could create a new section, which will become section 4, titled appeals, and then the same language, the student's parent or legal guardian may appeal the determination as outlined in section 1 above if the student has reached the age, and then keep the rest of it so it'll be its own section, so that it becomes more of a broader appeal about anything residency related rather than being part of the preceding one narrow point that might be confusing to some people. Is that okay with committee members? And of course, we can further refine this during the first read for the full school committee. Does that work? Yes, okay. And then to Andy's point, which was section 2B, instead of subsequent enrollment, updated documented proof. Is that sufficient, Andy, or any other language you propose there?
That's good.
So,
yeah, and there's maybe no need to have it as a bullet, right? It can just be a paragraph like the rest. And then we should just remove the phrase subsequent enrollment from the section heading as well.
okay. So just the initial enrollment, so that subsection would stay, and then just have that sentence added on to section A. Is that what you're proposing?
I mean, I was thinking it could still be a separate section, but the name of the subsection would change because we're no longer using the phrase subsequent enrollment.
So maybe continued enrollment eligibility as the heading? Because that seems to be what it really is.
Yeah. And then again, the main point to get across is that, and this is what I missed before, is that the affidavit is annual, but the documentation won't be required annually. It'll be, I suppose, at Megan's discretion or something like that.
All right, any other proposed changes? No?
Can I just ask for one piece of clarification that I have run across recently is in section 1. Well, while we have everybody here, in section 1, the committee added a few years ago, if the student is residing here for 3 months or less, the student does not meet resident eligibility requirements. One little clarification for myself even is whether that's 3 months of in the town or 3 months of the school year. family moves in June, may they enroll for 4 weeks' time if they're going to be here through August? Or is the intent that the 3 months be concurrent with the school year?
Do any subcommittee members or Suzanne have any strong feelings about this, about what it should be? Certainly open to changing it now.
Megan, what's your recommendation?
I think in terms of the economy, if you will, of providing an enrollment to a student for 4 weeks is a heavy lift for both our educators and for our students. It's a very difficult transition to make for that short a period of time. Especially, it's usually at the end of the school year, for instance, when things are winding down or families are simply visiting for just that end period, or they're coming at the beginning of the school year and then they leave after a month. It's very disruptive. And I do find that families find that 3-month rule and then say, well, we're here for, and it's difficult to make a ruling on my end based on the language in the policy.
Does it happen very often?
Enough.
Okay.
All right, then how about on that sentence, it reads, it is presumed that if a student is residing here for 3 months or less during the academic school year, the student does not meet resident eligibility requirements, then it specifies has to be during the school year, the 3 months. How do other subcommittee members feel about that addition?
I guess my question is, Megan, what is the implication? Where do they go to school? If they are here for 3 months?
They're considered visitors to the community and not residents. So they're only able to go to school in a public school system if they are residents. And if you're here for only a couple of months, you're not really making this your home, right? You're visiting. So that is how the committee has previously written this in, is that 3-month language. Some private schools are willing to take students, but not all are willing to take students on for what amounts to quite a lot of work. And the students don't get as much benefit as they should because they don't get the time with our educators to really benefit.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm a pain in this meeting, but again, I want to go to the equity issue. So if someone moves here for, say, moves to Massachusetts for a year or a 2-year-long fellowship in the Longwood area, they intend to stay for 2 years, but they're in Brookline for the first three months of that. So maybe they arrive. I mean, I know this isn't generally when people arrive, but say that someone arrived in the spring, they wouldn't have any educational opportunity available for their child.
They're going to be here for 2 years. No problem.
Maybe not in Brookline. I mean, like, how do we know?
Based on the documentation that they would provide.
Okay.
If they're in an Airbnb for 3 weeks.
Right. Understood. But
Right.
Okay.
So then the documentation they have to provide is to prove their intention to be here for longer than 3 months. Okay.
Yeah, I sort of, I think, share Andy's concern about what's happening to these students
Yeah.
in that time frame.
Megan, what about the scenario where a student is a ward of the state, of DCF, or foster, and it's a temporary?
Yeah, the policy that the committee recently voted on covers that situation.
So this wouldn't apply to that student.
Correct. Would be an exception.
Thanks.
So if it's not about actual how long someone has resided up to that point, but the expectation, then perhaps further change the language to it is presumed that if a student is anticipated to reside here for 3 months or less during the academic school year. Because a concern that I would have is if the family moves a day before school starts and the goal is to be there for maybe the whole school year, but they don't have the 3 months at the point of registration. certainly I would hope we would want to let those students in. But at
Yes,
that point, they're not officially residents because the 3 months haven't passed. But if they can show that they're going to be for 3 months or longer, then I would think they ought to be eligible. Jennifer?
So I guess I was understanding it a little differently than that, David. Like, I don't think they don't have to be here for 3 months in order to qualify. They just have to intend to be here for longer. Am I understanding that right, Megan? They don't have to have already been here for 3 months.
no, they don't.
It's,
You have to present a lease that spans, for a lease, for example, that spans that period of time.
can you give us just a little bit more detail on like how many students this, really fall into this category? And what are some of the I'm just trying to contextualize it and sort of like what that looks like, what this looks like for a family in real time, in real life. So what are the situations where people would come for only and register only for a few months intentionally?
Sure. Usually, the most common circumstance I have seen in my time in this role have been students whose parents are have a literal limited program with a university or a hospital to conduct research, and they are, like the letter says, you're here for 3 months. That's all you get to study with us. That's the entirety of the time they're here. Or it could be like 6 weeks, something like that. Universities, of course, extend such experiences to our researchers and physicians and so forth. That's the most common context that I would be seeing this kind of request in. Families wishing to bring their children with them to have the American or Boston or Brookline experience while their parent is doing this research, etc. That's the most common that I can think of. I can't really think of many other circumstances, to be honest.
And about how many children do you think or students would this potentially affect per calendar school year?
Just a handful. I mean, the policy has had that 3 months or less for quite some time, a number of years now. So I don't know how many it has already pulled back from making the attempt to come, for instance. So I can't tell you because I wasn't in this role prior to that language. But it must have been important enough to add it at that time.
Do we know what the state and or federal requirements are for how long a student can go without being enrolled in a school? Because if it's less than 3 months, then I don't think we should have this as in our policy, because we're essentially telling families that they cannot comply with the law. But I think we need to make sure we know what those relevant laws are at the state and federal levels.
Yeah, I agree fully with that. I don't want to be not offering an education to someone who's eligible under state and or federal law.
And I'm just trying to think if I were taking my children over to Europe for, I don't know, 3 months, but I want them in school or not. I don't know. I mean, if you knew you were only going to be there 3 months, you probably would get work from your local school, your home school, and bring it over. It'd be kind of fun to have them in their school if they could do the language. If they can't do the language, it would be really hard. So I kind of see both sides.
I mean, I agree with you on a personal level, Suzanne, but I just do worry that if the state and or federal government have a different requirement, that a child cannot go more than X period of time without being enrolled in school, and then we make it impossible for a family to comply with what the law says. I just want to make sure that we match up with the law. And even if we don't, whether we value providing some education rather than none for those who are here for less than 3 months.
I agree. We should check. I mean, I think Megan's making the distinction between a visitor and a resident. So, if you're visiting, I don't know what their expectation is. Probably depends on the country they're coming from.
I mean, I don't think we should necessarily assume that this will be a foreign family. It could be an American family who, is on a short-term gig here, and can we actually deprive their child of, any right to a public education during that period?
Well, that's a good point.
Right, well, I think back to the example I gave earlier in this meeting, I think it was an American family that was having an issue. I don't know the details of it, not going to discuss this here, it was a private matter, but it is a scenario that happens. And so I think we need to be aware of all the possible permutations of it.
And so Megan, how have you been deciding these cases so far, like without clear language on this?
Doing the best that we can in conversation with families and explaining what the policy as it is written says, doing our best.
But what I mean is, what decision have you been making in these cases? Is there a way to summarize your thinking on this?
If they can show me a continuous 3 months, we accept the students. If they cannot, we tell them that they are considered visitors.
And it's continuous 3 months at any time, doesn't have to be during the school year.
That's where it gets tricky.
Jennifer, go ahead.
I don't know. I was just doing a little research, trying to see how long kids can be. I mean, my gut says that they can't be out of school for more than a couple of weeks. I don't think you can be unenrolled. You're supposed to be enrolled all the time. So I don't know if we'll be able to keep that in, although ideally we want our students, sort of committed to the community, to the classroom community for their, but I don't know if we can.
Right, I have that concern as well, because in Massachusetts, at least, if you have 10 unexcused absences in a row, that's pretty much an automatic trigger for something called a CRA, a child requiring assistance, and it leads to legal action. And that's just 10 days, that's just 10 school days. So 3 months seems to really be pushing it. But I would want to make sure I know what the actual requirement is.
How can we find that? Where do we find that out? Does anybody know where we would find that legal requirement? I'm just wondering if it's something we can look up right now, or if this is something we need advice on. Just in trying to move this forward.
DESE might have something on it. There may be something in state statute. I don't know that we can get a quick answer this moment. What my suggestion would be is that we not move to change that current language at this moment, but with the understanding that we'll get further information on what the requirements are. And then if we end up voting for referral to the full committee, we can address that issue then, because I'm also mindful of the time constraints that Megan is under for kindergarten registration. So I'd rather not hold up the entire policy consideration effectively 2 months. If we put this off till our November meeting, then school committee is not addressing it until late November or December, and that'll be too late. There's nothing that prevents us from further modifying this when we meet before the full school committee. Any other questions, points, concerns? All right, seeing none, I am going to move that we recommend this draft to the full school committee for a first read, subject to 2 edits that we made as a committee to section 2B, changing the heading to continued enrollment eligibility and removing the subsequent enrollment term and referring to it as updated documented proof. And also in the last paragraph of the current section 3 enforcement, separating the last 2 sentences into their own section, which would have the subheading appeals. Appeals would become the new number 4, which means penalties would be number 5 and exceptions number 6. So subject to those changes, I'm going to move that we refer this policy draft to the full school committee. Is there a second? All right, thank you, Andy. Andy, your vote?
Yes.
Jennifer, your vote?
Yes, but I'm pretty sure we're gonna have to change that other rule.
No, I agree. I just, in the interest of time, I
Yeah,
would
that's
rather.
fine.
that
We can discuss it at full school committee, but my gut is telling me we have to change it. Okay.
I agree. Valerie?
Yes, with Jennifer's same concern.
Yes, and I also vote yes. And very soon, I will, after this meeting, I'll look into further what those requirements are, and also those at central office can do the same, and we can figure out what it is that's the minimum requirement, and then even beyond that, have a discussion at full school committee as to what our values are around offering educational opportunities, even if there's not some kind of rigid legal constraint around it. All right, so that brings us to our next agenda item, which is a discussion of policies related to school facility restrooms, gender neutral restrooms, and access to hygiene and sanitary products. These two issues have been raised recently by members of the public, some who wanted to know what happened regarding gender neutral bathrooms, which was something we were going to pursue. And then for whatever reason, we didn't end up actually codifying a policy on it. I'm not sure why. I think that draft predates my tenure on the policy subcommittee by a little bit. And then also very recently, members of the public have been bringing up when we're going to have the menstrual hygiene products available in our schools, because that apparently hasn't happened yet. And there was a town meeting warrant article that applied to town buildings, not to schools necessarily, but we did say that we believed in the spirit of it and had indicated that it was a direction we wanted to move in as well. Now, although Casey was not able to make the meeting today, she did send us prior to today's meeting the draft on gender neutral bathrooms that had been considered. I don't know if subcommittee members have had an opportunity to look that over. I don't have this docketed for a possible vote or anything like that, but for discussion purposes, if anyone has had an opportunity to look it over and provide some thoughts. It does seem rather long for, although it's on gender.
It's a bigger policy. So I worked on this policy long before my school committee tenure. And it covers many, many subjects, only a paragraph of which, I believe only a paragraph of which dealt with restrooms at the time. And some of it, I glanced over it. Some of it is already outdated language that would probably need to be updated. So I would recommend docketing it. It doesn't actually, I don't actually believe it even goes to gender neutral bathrooms. I don't think it requires them in this document. I think that was still a discussion point back in 2018 or 19, whenever this was initially developed. I think 2018.
Would you like to provide some broader context over what led to this draft and what's happened since that time?
Sure, to the extent that I can. I was asked at that time by district leadership to look into their current policies, which at the time I don't think gender identity was particularly addressed in many of them. So this was to be a fairly comprehensive set of policies on gender identity. And so there's a lot of definitional work in it, which is why it's very long. There's a lot of definitional pieces to it. I do think that even in these last 2.5 years, as a town, we've made progress, and there have been warrant articles passed and things like that that address some of this, and some of the school buildings and the new construction have required gender neutral bathrooms. So I do think that this policy, while a good start, needs to be updated and I didn't review it again fully, but my recollection is that it does not address gender neutral bathrooms in a cohesive way.
Okay. Now, also within the context of this broader discussion, I highlighted a couple of current policies that we have. One of them, which can be found on page A3, which is our non-discrimination, equal opportunity, basic commitment, and the other is facilities development. I was looking through our policy handbook to see where would gender neutral bathrooms, for instance, and sort of these issues of equity more broadly, fit into current policies. In some of my discussions with the superintendent, he has suggested that before we jump into creating a new policy, that we sometimes look whether an existing policy could potentially cover an issue. At minimum, it would seem that it could be a place where we could position such a policy embedded within a broader one, rather than starting a completely new one. So that's why I brought attention to these two policies, because for non-discrimination, equal opportunity, it's talking about, it doesn't really include anything on access. And I'm thinking that it's not just about equal opportunity, it's not just about discrimination, but we also want to make sure that all of our students, regardless of their demographic grouping, have access to services, have access to facilities, have access to menstrual hygiene products, for instance. So I'm thinking we could consider expanding the non-discrimination, equal opportunity policy to include access. And then similarly, on the facilities development policy, it talks a lot about developing core common spaces, but there's no mention of restrooms or locker rooms. Locker rooms might fit under gymnasiums, but it doesn't include some of what we're talking about today. So we might want to consider modifying both of those policies. Any thoughts from other subcommittee members or from you, Suzanne?
So I think that's a good start for restrooms, David, but I do think that the gender identity policy, the larger policy, does address access pieces, including access to, again, this is by memory, nursing and how to address records and things of that nature that are really critical for students who are dealing with gender identity, and at what age you can do certain things on your own without parental notification and all that sort of. So I guess what I'd say is I'm not prepared to throw that policy away. I think we should look at it at some point. I know it's not docketed for today.
That's fine. And we can look at it. I'm glad that Casey was able to provide this for us. I'm also not trying to suggest that we should not have a standalone policy on gender neutrality and a policy to support students who are transgender and or gender nonconforming. I think that is very important. I'm just saying more as a general matter, we can look at which policies exist and where to build out from there. But yes, I would agree that this should be a standalone. Something like bathrooms, though, I think it certainly fit in on facilities. And even if it did become a standalone policy, we would still want to make sure that our policies are within alignment of each other. So currently our non-discrimination equal opportunity policy doesn't say anything about access. I think access is pretty vital. And then our facilities policy doesn't say anything about restrooms, locker rooms. It's only a subset of common areas. Do any other subcommittee members have thoughts, or Suzanne? What about the question of taking up again the policy to support students who are transgender and or gender nonconforming? Jennifer?
Are you asking if we think we should have one or that we should pursue that as a separate?
If this is something we should pursue.
Well, and I think the district is asking us also to look at it as well. So, and it's something we were working on because the district had asked us before, many years ago, pre-COVID. And it was going through review, and we were awaiting a lot of feedback from the district and other community partners. And so I think it just, it never came back to us at that point for review. So I do think we need to really look at the language and make sure it's really updated. And we were grappling with a lot of trying to language pieces, what to include, what not to include, what's procedure, what's policy. So I do think we'll probably have to review the draft in detail. And I'm not sure, who might be able to help us with going through that. If we just want to do it internally. So, I mean, I'm up for it if this is something that, we feel like can't be addressed within another policy. And I do want to see us make some progress on the commitments that we've made in the past about gender neutral bathrooms and as well as menstrual products, which we haven't made the movement on. I think if I recall, David, and I think that there was an intention, a good intention to do those, and we didn't necessarily need a policy because we were going to operationally do it. And I just don't know if with COVID, if that ended up happening. So I'd love to see us kind of come back to that.
Andy?
I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
Oh, you have, thank you. Andy?
Jennifer, do you remember who on the staff was sort of helping the policy subcommittee at that point? You said the staff were also reviewing this.
At the time, I remember at the time, former Superintendent Andrew Bott had come, and I'm not sure who else that was there in the department that is still there might be able to help. I think Casey was there, but I don't think she was the lead on constructing the policy. So it might have been coming through. I don't remember.
It was Nicole Gittens.
I was going to say, I think it was OTL that was the lead on it. And so, there are new people in some of those positions. And so there's not that historical knowledge, institutional knowledge on that piece, aside from, I remember working on it. And I remember Val's name I remember former Superintendent Andrew Bott saying he was going to reach out to Val to get feedback. So it just never came back to us from there, but it was something that the district was interested in us pursuing.
Okay. Suzanne?
Yeah, on the matter of menstrual products, we don't need a policy on that, do we? Could we just operationalize that? Do we need to vote? I know Matt's waiting to hear from us, Matt Gillis. And I know that the town voted for that in public buildings, I guess, except for schools. Is that how it went? And when I spoke to Matt a couple of weeks ago, he thought perhaps it was happening in the new wing of the high school.
This came up at government relations last week, and I think it was reported, it was sort of secondhand, but it was reported that they're charging for the products at the high school.
Oh,
Is my recollection?
Yeah, I know that's not the school, but that's considered a public building, not a school building, I believe, or a town building. I don't know. They're all town buildings, but the pool is not charging. That I know, that I see.
Jennifer?
So to that point, I know that they're charging also in the middle schools. So I've heard from a number of sources that they are charging. So they may or may not be available. There was some question about whether or not there was product in dispensers and there was a cost for them. And I had some young people who were advocating for us to come back to this issue. And I think that we had said we were going to operationalize this and not do a policy, but and things were very, very hectic, and COVID really, made things very challenging. We had other operational things that I understand were priorities. So I'm just wondering if it may be beneficial to make it into a policy so that we can ensure that it can get the attention that it needs. I mean, if Matt's waiting, I'm happy to make a motion. I feel like we voted on this already. Did we not, David? I thought we did at full committee previous to COVID, that this was a priority. So do we need to re-vote, or can we just use a previous vote?
I think what we voted on was to endorse the warrant article and say that we were going to support the spirit of it and move in that direction in the school buildings. And yes, then the pandemic hit, and so that shifted priorities somewhat. But this is very much an issue. I personally don't really like hearing that we're charging students for it. So currently, how do students get access in the middle schools, for instance? Do they go to the principal's office?
I think so. And this is what, if you remember, I'm not sure who was on policy at the time, because we had a number of community members, active community members, and some of the warrant article folks come and talk with us. And so part of the issue is the travel time in the high school, for instance, the travel time to the nurse to get the free supplies and then get back to class on time. And kids were concerned about getting marked tardy because they were late to class, and you can only have so many absences and tardies. So the goal was to make products accessible in many areas in the school, including gender neutral bathrooms. There was some discussion about all bathrooms in lieu of not having gender neutral bathrooms. There was some lengthy discussion about that. And so I thought it was our intention to offer them within the restroom facilities free of charge in a dispenser. And I think we had even priced out what the dispensers and everything would cost at that time. I think Matt did a lot of that work for us. So, you know, I'd love to see us come back to that. And and there was discussion about including the middle schools. And so I really do think you know, we should think about our middle school students and provide those services as well to them to increase access and whether or not people are comfortable. And there was a heartfelt conversation about folks who were, I know, I don't want to get this wrong, or identifying as perhaps a different gender than their body type, or than their sex. Maybe that's what I want to say. So I think we should just provide a lot of access and make it easy for folks to get what they need. There was likened to having access to toilet paper.
That's why I don't like the idea that we would be charging for this, but it would be helpful to know what costs are involved.
Well, Matt knows that because we had this discussion, and I think he has some sense of that.
Okay. Robin, if you could promote Tommy Vitolo to panelist, he's going to be participating in our next agenda item.
So what is our next step on this before we go, David, on to the next items? Or Suzanne, what needs to happen in order to get this to move forward?
So I also received a call from Matt, and he wanted some direction on how to proceed with this. I do think that we don't necessarily need a formal vote. We should move on it, and we may want to consider embedding it in a policy. So it sounds like you're leaning in that direction, Jennifer. How do you feel about that, Andy and Valerie?
I think it's extremely important that we lean into this and put it into policy.
All right. And how about you, Andy?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, can it be a quick policy, or is this could we just, I just hate to delay it too much since the town has already moved forward, the school's lagging.
Yeah, to that, are we sure that the warrant article specifically excludes the schools?
I'll double check on it. I'm pretty sure it was just about town buildings, but
If that's so, then why did people come to the school committee? I remember a rather elaborate meeting about this with many comments from the public and the sponsors of the warrant article. So if it didn't affect the schools at all, why did we have all that?
In fact, Andy, we had high school students come and speak to us.
Indeed, that's why I'm very surprised to hear that it didn't actually, the warrant article actually didn't cover us, because I thought it did.
And how are we not town buildings?
We are town buildings.
So the policy, or it could just be as simple as a statement saying that, yeah, we're complying with the warrant article.
it looks like State Representative Vitolo might have something on this issue as well. We're talking about menstrual hygiene products and restrooms, and whether the warrant article applies to the schools or just to town departments.
So I I was paying attention to that and to, of course, there's some state legislation on similar topics. My recollection when Ms. Stone headed up the effort was that because it was going before town meeting and, the schools recognizing that it's not as simple as the school committee does everything on the schools and the town does everything else. My recollection very much was that town meeting ought not invade in school committee space and that it was explicitly for non-school buildings and that essentially town meeting was leaving it to the school committee to decide what ought to happen inside the buildings for which it cares most about. That's my recollection, both of the language that was passed and of the conversation around that language. But of course, the resolutions that town meeting passes are certainly public documents, and I'm sure someone can hunt down the actual where now therefore clauses that passed.
Jennifer?
So I'd like to move that I would make a motion, I guess, to send to full committee from this subcommittee that we operationalize free access for menstrual hygiene products in our high schools and middle school grade appropriate bathrooms. And I'm happy to take it up as a policy, but the policy will delay it. And I'd like to see us get this, because we did make a commitment prior. I would think we can move pretty quickly on this. And I think Matt is looking for feedback from us. So I don't know what mechanism we need to do to get this. I suspect the full committee will want to weigh in on a, maybe they do, maybe they don't, to weigh in on this, but I want to move it quickly, just because we've had much discussion and I feel like we made a commitment to this.
Can I make a friendly amendment, Jennifer?
Yes.
So to all bathrooms, to address your point of the differences between gender identity and sex assigned at birth.
Yeah, I'm all for it. And I think we'd even done some math on that. I mean, I would like to move it forward. I would like to take it to the full committee and get at least a vote of support for immediately operationalizing it without the policy. I don't know if that's something we need to do, but whatever it is that we need to get Matt Gillis so he can move on making this a reality. I'm happy to move.
All right, I'll second. Jennifer, your vote?
Yes.
Andy, your vote?
Yes.
Valerie, your vote?
Yes.
And I also vote yes. So Suzanne, we can probably docket this for an upcoming school committee meeting so we can have a discussion on it and then on the policy level, develop a policy on it. But I'm glad that we're moving in this direction because there is a lot of interest in this and rightfully so. It's very important. And we do have staff and district leaders who are asking for direction from us.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's good. It's a good move.
David,
Right.
do you still want to work on the facilities piece on gender neutral bathrooms, or do you want to hold off on that?
Sure, we can do that. But just a moment before we do that, Robin, can you promote Clint Richmond to panelist? He will also be participating with our next agenda item. All right, go ahead, Valerie.
Just wanted to amend that so that all new construction and any substantial renovation require the addition of a gender neutral bathroom.
So I did not docket a vote on amending this policy for today's meeting.
Okay.
I highlighted this policy more so that we could look at where we could address gender neutral bathrooms. But this is something that I'll bring back for a subsequent policy meeting and then docket it properly for having a vote, because there might be some other edits that we may want to make to this policy. I'd also want to consult with Helen, who chairs the capital subcommittee, about anything that she would like to change that's not necessarily related to gender neutral bathrooms. I think we want to do a more comprehensive edit on this one. So I'll probably docket it for the November meeting. And the language you just proposed for gender neutral bathrooms will be included in that draft.
Thanks.
All right, anyone else who with anything on this issue of gender neutral bathrooms and or provision of menstrual hygiene products? Okay, seeing none, we will move to our next agenda item, which is a discussion of municipal and state action regarding pesticide use on school grounds. And we are joined by State Representative Tommy Vitolo. Thank you very much for finding time out of your very busy schedule to join us. Tommy is a co-sponsor of House Bill 926, which addresses this issue. And we are also joined by Clint Richmond, Chair of the Green Caucus. Thank you for joining us as well. Clint is the person who brought this to our attention. So Clint, if you want to give a quick introduction again about why this is important, and then we can move to Tommy. We'll talk about the state bill.
Thank you, Mr. Perlman. As I said, I was introduced. I'm Clint Richmond, town meeting member, precinct 6, and also on the executive committee of the Massachusetts Sierra Club, which is one of the supporters of this bill. And I lead our toxics efforts at the Sierra Club. So I'm here wearing, I suppose, both my Brookline hat as well as my Sierra Club hat. And I had originally raised this issue with the chair as one of several issues that I know we still have more to get to, but I'm glad that this one's on the agenda tonight to address the issue of pesticide use in schools. And there are two aspects to this. One is, what is our current policy and what is our current pesticide use on school grounds? And then the other is, how can we work to promote this as a public health issue throughout the state by supporting Bill H 926 as well. So it seems like the agenda item is limited more toward the bill rather than any report on what's been happening at PSB to date on school grounds, but I know it's of concern to parents as well. So I hope that there'll be some space to talk about that in the future. And if we're going to be supporting this bill, as has been done in Cambridge and other municipalities, that it would be great if we could already say that we are trying to comply with this bill and the policy that it incorporates as a precursor to show that it can be done. So it kind of lends support within the community as well as sort of lobbying outside of the community.
All right, thank you. Tommy, do you want to talk about House Bill 926, how it came about and your role in it and where it's headed?
Sure. Tommy Vitolo, state representative for the 15th Norfolk District, which is entirely within the town of Brookline. H 926 is filed by Rep. Carmen Gentile, and the idea is really of the bill is really to modernize the way we think about these chemicals. Better living through chemistry has been a phrase in use for about 50 years, and there may be some better living through chemistry, but if we're going to do that, we ought to at least use our modern understanding of chemistry and not an outdated one. And so since 2001, schools and daycares have been required to submit integrated pest management plans to the MDAR, the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources. And the problem is that the list that's allowed includes some things that we've since figured out. Kids in particular ought not be putting into their bodies. And it turns out that one, kids are more efficient at ingesting pesticides because, well, they're kids, they play, right? And two, their small bodies are more negatively impacted. I hate to say exponentially, right? But they're more susceptible to these sorts of problems that these pesticides can cause than adults. And so it makes sense for us to use modern understanding around pesticides for all spaces, for all people. But it makes sense for us to start with those who are most vulnerable in general, but specifically most vulnerable to pesticide problems, and that is children. And so H 926 brings pesticide protections in line with current science, at least, if not exactly, certainly far more so than the current status quo. And so it updates the list of approved pesticides to only allow those considered to be minimum risk by the EPA. And it creates a uniform standard across the state. And it's modeled after laws that are already in place in adjacent large states, including Connecticut and New York. The bill is currently in front of ENRA, the Environment, Natural Resources and Agriculture Committee. There is no hearing scheduled for the bill at this moment, but all bills in Massachusetts legislature get a hearing. And so it will have a hearing and within the next few months, almost certainly. And to that end, if this subcommittee or the school committee is inclined to make a statement about this bill, I would encourage it to be thoughtful, but be expeditious, because coming out and supporting a bill after it has been disposed is not nearly as helpful as coming out and supporting a bill before the hearing has taken place. As Vice Chair Perlman mentioned, I am a co-sponsor. I do believe that it moves us in a better direction. I certainly, as the proud parent of a 5th grader and a 1st grader, would support Mr. Richmond's encouragement that the town implement policies that are consistent with 926 as soon as we can, whether or not 926 becomes law this session or not. As a legislator, I would be more than happy for the town to support this bill. And as a parent, I'd be more than happy for the town to implement the ideas behind this bill wherever it is that my children or their friends are likely to be.
All right, thank you. And to Mr. Richmond's earlier point about other communities in Massachusetts having already endorsed this proposed legislation, I included as an attachment language that was used by the Somerville School Committee. And my recommendation would be that at minimum, as a starting point, that we consider similar language. But I also think we should go beyond that and consider a policy of our own, getting ahead of the state. We don't necessarily have to wait. Andy, go ahead.
Thanks, David. Could I ask Clint or Tommy, do we know sort of how close Brookline already comes to fulfilling these requirements with or without state action?
I do not, but as Representative Vitolo stated, all the schools have to submit IPM plans. And I believe when we last talked about this, Mr. Perlman, there was a discussion around reviewing those. And I'm sorry, I haven't done that either, but I had only very short notice for this meeting, so I didn't really get a chance to better prepare. But as Mr. Vitolo stated, that the other states have implemented these policies already. And I should emphasize, this is more than just sort of eliminating the bad actors among pesticides, but it's rather a commitment toward organic landscaping, which has been done in communities such as Marblehead and other communities around the states on various parks, municipal parks. So it's these minimal acceptance pesticides are called 25B by the EPA, referring to some section of EPA law, and it's really limiting things like essential oils like clove and garlic, and so it's much different than kind of conventional landscaping. So it's not a commitment you make lightly, but as Mr. Vitolo stated, I think there's a lot of interest among both for his family and other families in town to adopt such a program. And I think there are, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Vitolo, but there are some emergency situations that will allow you to maybe not always have to be restricted to that. But in terms of day-to-day treatment of outdoor spaces, it's a new, it's a different approach. And while the town of Brookline, is pretty good about IPM, and I would say is not a heavy pesticide user, they do use them, on occasion. And you can look through, Open Checkbook and see pesticide purchases. A lot of these are going on at the golf course and areas like that are sort of high performance, high use properties with specific requirements. So again, it's not being heavily used at schools today.
I was just asking because if in fact we're already not using any of these things, then that would be a good thing to have in a statement.
I think the problem is that, you know, you don't want it to be discretionary. I mean, we have a very good, you know, DPW department. We have our new Parks and Open Space Director, Alexandra Vecchio. You know, she's very well aware of these policies. You know, a lot of people are contacting her to talk about, you know, ways to become more environmental as a community. You know, whether it's with our roads as well as our grounds and all of our properties. So I think she's been interested in wanting to try this. So, I mean, that would be, you know, one stage. So if PSB said, hey, you know, we'd like you to trial some of these approaches on school properties, I think that would be welcomed by that department. But, you know, you'll want to check in with them directly.
And can I just add that whether or not Brookline voluntarily gets most of the way there or all of the way there, there's two different reasons why it would be good for a Brookline community that embrace these values to encourage other communities to have to embrace those values through law. The first is that Brookline students go to other communities' outdoor spaces, most obviously associated with athletics, but not uniquely limited to athletics. And so to the extent that our school children are in other communities in their spaces, we would like those spaces to be using safe pesticides as well. And the other reason is that the town uses vendors both for inventory, right, for the pesticides themselves, and sometimes contractors. And to the extent that we raise the standards across the state, the town, I suspect, will find it has access to a healthier competitive set of contractors and inventories to acquire. So it becomes easier for the town to achieve these goals at a lower cost if, in fact, every municipality is also meeting the standard, because the landscaping companies, the suppliers of pesticides and other chemicals are only going to stock those that comply, and there'll be more choices. And so I think it is to Brookline's benefit if H 926 passes, even if Brookline is already complying completely with the language within H 926.
Okay, thank you. Val?
Clint, you had mentioned something, Clint, outside of the pesticides, I believe. I just wanted clarification on what that entails. On the landscaping, I think you'd call it organic landscaping or something similar that was beyond just the pesticide use?
No, I meant that as equivalent to that.
Okay.
That if you with organic landscaping, you are not using traditional pesticides like, you know, malathion or glyphosate or something like that.
Okay.
But that you're limited to these 25B products, which are you know, biodegradable essential oils and that sort of thing.
Okay.
And Mr. Richmond, is it your sense that we would be better off pursuing a policy that went in the direction of organic landscaping and not specific to the elimination of pesticides? What do you see as the ideal end goal?
Well, I guess technically speaking, organic landscaping is a little bit beyond eliminating the use of traditional pesticides. It could entail, for example, a selection of, you know, fertilizers that might be applied to, you know, make sure that the fields are healthy. So I think that those are outside of the scope of H 926. So to the extent that you want to adopt the issue actually was raised by Ms. Fries, which I think is helpful to embrace organic landscaping, it would be good. But, you know, I guess that's the additional step, maybe, that there's a little bit more to that. And there are organizations such as the Northeast Organic Farming Association, which assists farmers and municipalities in pursuing this. There may be some I'm not sure, what other resources might be available to that's specific to government agencies on this, but there's a lot of discussion around greener landscaping practices, whether it's electric equipment or something. Again, that's completely outside of the scope of H 926, completely outside of the scope of organic landscaping even. But I'm just saying there's a lot of development in this area, and I think that particularly with the sensitivity to children, that you want to be minimizing exposures of all manner of harmful chemicals. But the focus of this is on pesticides specifically.
I do want to let the committee know that I had some conversations with Helen Charlepsky, the chair of the Capital Subcommittee, as well as Matt Gillis regarding the current use of pesticides. Mr. Gillis indicated that there is some limited pesticide use. He was not able to make it to today's meeting. I'm hopeful, though, that by the time we discuss this again, hopefully in November, that we'll have some additional clarity on that and a possible policy for consideration. I do think it's important that we understand the financial costs and the trade-offs. Of course, finance in and of itself should not be a reason not to pursue the elimination of pesticide use, but it's still a factor that people are going to be curious about and are going to want to know about. Representative Vitolo or Mr. Richmond, do either of you have an idea about some of the financial cost trade-offs?
My only glib answer is wealthy, poor, and moderate school districts in 2 adjacent states with similar land use and similar labor cost structures are currently doing it. And so it can't be so expensive as to not be within the realm. But no, I don't have more detail than that.
All right, thank you.
I don't either specifically, and because these are at different, buying these things at municipal level in bulk versus what you might use in your home. I'd clarify a question for you, Mr. Perlman. When you say the November meeting, do you mean the November meeting of this subcommittee or the November meeting of the school committee?
The November meeting of the policy subcommittee is what I'm hoping to do following, of course, I'm going to have to discuss this with the other members of this committee, whether there would be an interest in developing a school committee policy regarding pesticide use on school grounds. And depending on how that conversation goes, which we'll have right now, my goal would be to docket for our November policy meeting a review of a draft policy, and also to hopefully have Matt Gillis present on that day to describe for us in greater detail what the current practices are and some of the costs that are involved, both financial, but also in terms of mitigation for when something goes awry if a child ingests something. Suzanne?
Yeah, thank you, David. So I'm wondering, I thought perhaps there were 2 things we could talk about. One is supporting the bill, and that we should probably try to do in a more timely fashion, if I understand Tommy's thoughts about that, that we would do an H 926 support if the committee so desires, and bring that to the full committee, do that very quickly if we could, and then may perhaps follow up with a policy for use in Brookline schools specifically, which may require, a little deeper dive in terms of developing that policy and bringing it to the full committee.
I do think there are 2 separate agenda items. I would hope that we could try to make progress on both of them. Definitely support for H 926. I think that's something we could clearly do in timely fashion. Development of a policy, it will depend, of course, on the other information that we receive, but I would want to get started on it at least. Mr. Richmond brought this to our attention last spring. It's been a while, so hopefully we can make some progress and we can have everyone available for the next meeting on the staff side. Jennifer?
I'd love to hear from other members of the subcommittee, but I would support a statement in support of the legislation, and as well support a policy of the school committee. So I'm happy to move those after discussion if there's support on the committee.
Andy?
Would this statement be identical to the Cambridge and Somerville texts that we got, which I think were the same?
Right, they were the same. I think we could decide to alter it somewhat if we wanted to, but I'm comfortable with the language that Somerville and Cambridge used. Do others have thoughts on that?
On supporting the bill, I
Right.
think the language looks great for both.
Okay. As for a potential policy, which I'm hoping we'll consider that as well at our November meeting. Any thoughts, any further thoughts on that, Valerie and Andy?
I absolutely think we should look at developing one, but I think that, as you stated and as Jennifer stated, and we've all discussed, there's some research for us to do and some staff input that we'll need.
Jennifer?
I'm just wondering if we could docket for the November, well, I would look, well, two things. I'm wondering if we can docket for November, a presentation from staff on what would be the financial implications, the operational implications of adopting a policy. I don't know if any other districts have a policy or if MASC has anything we can build off of to save time. And my second thought was I would be happy to make a motion to use the language from the existing Somerville, Cambridge support statements and move it forward to the full school committee.
All right, I'll second your motion, Jennifer. So I guess we can vote on it then. Jennifer,
Yes.
Valerie,
Yes,
Andy?
Yes.
And I also vote yes. And I see that Mr. Richmond has his virtual hand raised. Go ahead.
Did you get everyone's vote?
Yes,
Okay.
4-0 in favor.
And so, yeah, no, I'm very grateful that this motion has been made, particularly to second what Mr. Vitolo said about legislative scheduling. I was under the impression, and maybe Mr. Vitolo has more recent information, that these bills were going to be heard in September and they've been delayed. So we're really a little overdue for the hearing on these. So the extent that you can get this on the November full committee is extremely important. Because, you know, the hearing could be this month. I mean, they don't give us a lot of notice, and there's a big package of them, and there's a lot to discuss there. There, you know, some other pieces moving at the state level, but it could be happening, you know, as soon as next week. So
I would just quickly add that in my view, it's best if the support comes before the date of the hearing, but that is not the only time by which support can be helpful. And so the committee will hear the bill on a particular date, but it will not vote on whether or not to advance the bill on that date. It will sit on the bill for a while, gather more information. Committee members will deliberate amongst themselves. And then sometime later, the bill will be reported by the committee either to study or with the recommendation of favorable action, or I suppose with the recommendation of unfavorable, but that's very rare. And so even if the committee hearing is October 30th, that would be a Saturday, that's unlikely, October 28th, that does not mean that you've missed the boat. You could still make a recommendation, and that recommendation could still be influential to the committee. So I agree with Mr. Richmond that time is of the essence if you are to influence the decision. And I would add that I think you're more influential if you get that in before the hearing, but do not think that if the hearing happens before the vote, that means you've missed the opportunity to have any influence. It is still influential, in my view, to submit testimony to committees after the hearing has happened, so long as the committee hasn't yet made a recommendation to the full body. And so don't feel like if you miss the committee hearing that you should just take it off the docket. I think it's still worthy of deliberation and a recommendation.
All right, Jennifer and then Valerie. Go ahead, Jennifer.
I was just wondering if there's any room on our docket for Thursday to put this forward if we have language already crafted. Is that even a remote possibility?
I think it is. So Suzanne and I have docket preview tomorrow morning, and we'll definitely discuss that. Valerie?
That might obviate the need for my question, which was if the sponsor of the bill would be so kind as to forward us the date of the hearing so that those of us who might want to testify in our individual capacity could do so.
The sponsor of the bill is Carmen Gentile, and you're welcome to reach out to his office.
You're a co-sponsor.
I will not offer to do that. And the reason I will not offer to do that is there are thousands of bills, and I simply cannot hold myself to the responsibility of keeping track of who cares about what bills and making sure they know about it. So I will not offer that service. Perhaps Mr. Richmond, who is tracking a smaller number of bills than I am, he's probably tracking only hundreds of bills instead of thousands, will offer to do that for you.
All right, any other thoughts on this agenda item? Well, I'm pleased that we made significant progress today, at least regarding support, the statement of support for House Bill 926. I'm hopeful that after tomorrow morning's docket preview, it will be on the next school committee agenda. And then hopefully for the November policy subcommittee meeting, we'll also be looking at an initial draft of a potential policy and at minimum a presentation on current practices and operations regarding pesticide use. Okay, so thank you very much, Representative Fotolo, for joining us. Thank you very much, Mr. Richmond, for joining us as well. And we'll continue to work on this very important issue.
Thank you.
And that brings us to new business. Is there any new business? Go ahead, Valerie.
Just old business that I hope that we resurrect soon, which is the seclusion and restraint policy discussion. So I hope we're able to have the appropriate staff with us at our next meeting if possible.
I certainly agree with that. Does anyone else have new or old business? All right, seeing none, thank you everyone for participating in today's policy subcommittee meeting. We will next be meeting on November 8th at 5 o'clock. Night, everyone.